Before you consider searching for an apartment on Craigslist, take a moment to think twice. It's not just about finding a good deal, it's about your safety. Let me share with you the chilling story of what happened to Jenna, a college student who thought she'd found the perfect place, only to uncover something far more sinister. When Jenna stumbled upon the Craigslist ad, it seemed like fate. The apartment was spacious, well lit, and only a short walk to campus. Rent was surprisingly affordable, and the landlord, Mr. Grayson, seemed warm and welcoming. His demeanor was a refreshing change from the gruff landlords she'd encountered before. Jenna had just moved to the city for graduate school and was desperate for a place to stay. The price and location were perfect, so she ignored the slight unease that prickled at the back of her mind. She signed the lease the same day she toured the apartment and moved in the following weekend. The place was exactly as advertised, but a few oddities stood out. At the end of the hallway, there was a door that Mr. Grayson had described as just storage. When she asked for the key to access it, he gave her a strange smile and replied, "There's nothing in there you need to worry about." Jenna's new roommate, Lisa, was another anomaly. She was listed on the lease, but Jenna never saw her during the move-in process. Mr. Grayson mentioned that Lisa worked odd hours and kept to herself, but he assured Jenna that Lisa was reliable and respectful. For the first week, the apartment seemed like a dream. Jenna spent her days exploring the city and her evenings unpacking. But as she settled in, strange things began to happen. It started with little noises, whispers late at night that seemed to come from the walls. At first, she brushed them off as the creaks and groans of an old building, but they grew louder each night. Lisa's presence, or lack thereof, became more unsettling. Jenna found evidence of her existence: half-empty coffee mugs left on the counter, a damp towel in the bathroom, and the faint scent of perfume in the hallway. Yet, she never saw Lisa come or go. One night, Jenna left a note on the fridge. "Hey Lisa, let's grab coffee sometime and finally meet. Jenna." The next morning, the note was gone, replaced by another written in jagged, hurried handwriting. "Leave." Jenna stared at the note, her heart racing. She tried to laugh it off as a prank, but unease settled over her. That night, she locked her bedroom door before going to bed. At 3 a.m., Jenna woke to the sound of her bedroom window creaking open. She bolted upright, her heart pounding. The window was wide open, the curtains fluttering in the cold night air. She was certain she had locked it before going to bed. The next morning, her unease turned to fear when she found her laptop open on the desk. Files she hadn't accessed were displayed on the screen, photos of her taken inside the apartment. One showed her unpacking boxes, another showed her asleep in bed. Terrified, Jenna decided to confront Mr. Grayson. She called him, but his tone was dismissive. "It's an old building, Jenna. Things can be quirky. Don't worry about it." That night, she couldn't sleep. The whispers had returned, louder and more distinct. They seemed to be coming from the locked door at the end of the hallway. Jenna grabbed a flashlight and crept toward it, her hands shaking. She tried the handle. It was locked. Determined, she searched the kitchen drawers for a spare key. When she found it, she hesitated for a moment before inserting it into the lock. The door creaked open, revealing a room that smelled of damp and decay. Inside, the walls were covered in scratched tally marks. A mattress lay in the corner, stained and worn. On the wall above it were Polaroid photos of people Jenna didn't recognize, their faces marked with red ink. Among them was a photo of Jenna, taken on the day she moved in. As she stepped further inside, her flashlight flickered. In the corner of the room, something moved. She froze as a gaunt figure emerged from the shadows. His hollow eyes met hers, and he whispered hoarsely, "You have to leave. He won't let you go if you stay." Jenna stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight. The door slammed shut behind her, and she was plunged into darkness. The whispers grew louder, surrounding her. She banged on the door, screaming for help. Suddenly, it swung open, and Mr. Grayson stood there, his face unnervingly calm. "What are you doing in here, Jenna?" he asked, his voice cold. Before she could answer, he stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a chilling silence. Jenna fled the apartment that night, leaving her belongings behind. She didn't stop running until she reached a friend's house on the other side of the city. Months later, she learned that the building had a dark history. Tenants frequently went missing, their disappearances dismissed as runaways or transients. Curiosity got the better of her one day, and she checked Craigslist. There it was, a new ad for a roommate in her old apartment. The pictures included one of Jenna, smiling nervously on the day she moved in. The ad described the apartment as perfect, or almost. Desperation gnawed at Scott as he stared at his phone screen. His life had become a constant uphill battle. Bills stacked on his kitchen table, eviction notices pinned to his door, and the suffocating weight of sleepless nights. He felt like the walls were closing in on him with each passing day until that Craigslist ad appeared on his feed. It promised everything he needed: $1,000 for a single night of work. The description was vague, only mentioning overnight security position at a warehouse, and the payment seemed far too generous to ignore. Scott stared at the ad for what felt like hours, rationalizing the risk away. Desperation always found ways to blind judgment. He clicked on the link, sent off an application, and waited. By the time night fell, his stomach had knots of worry and anticipation. But what choice did he have? A single $1,000 could cover the bills for 2 months and give him a fresh start. The address led him to a darkened industrial area on the edge of town. His headlights cut through the fog, illuminating empty streets and rusted factory walls. He could feel his heartbeat in his chest as he approached the large, decrepit structure. A long warehouse with broken windows and graffiti smeared on its outer walls. The air felt colder here, colder and alive in a way he couldn't explain. Scott parked his car and hesitated, staring at the yawning shadows that surrounded the entrance. A single light bulb above the doorway hung crookedly, flickering with each gust of wind. He was certain he was the only one in sight. His hands trembled as he grabbed his belongings and stepped into the gloom. Inside, the air was stale and metallic, carrying the scent of rust and dust. A sharp noise rang out somewhere deep within the warehouse, but Scott told himself it was just the wind rattling something, old machinery shifting, or his own nerves playing tricks on him. He glanced around the cavernous space, searching for some kind of sign or instruction. That's when he saw a man standing at the far end of the entrance. The man was dressed impeccably, gray slacks, a crisp white shirt, a sharp black tie, and a dark suit jacket. His hair was slicked back, his gaze calm and unyielding. Scott could feel him watching, his presence unsettling in the dim light. "Scott," the man said, his voice smooth and steady as it cut through the heavy silence. "I'm Mr. Gray. I'll be overseeing your shift tonight." Scott wasn't sure how this man knew his name, but before he could question it, Mr. Gray handed him a clipboard. The paper was pristine, save for a few instructions. The words, while short and to the point, carried an eerie sense of finality. "Do not leave the building until your shift is complete. Do not attempt to open the locked room. Do not respond to any sounds." Scott's throat tightened as he stared at the list. Something about the way Mr. Gray's voice lingered on the words "locked room" sent a chill down his spine. He glanced back toward the space behind Mr. Gray, where the shadows shifted, and noticed a steel door embedded into the far end of the warehouse. It was massive, locked with heavy bolts, and seemed out of place in the otherwise lifeless building. Mr. Gray clapped a hand on his shoulder and smiled, the smile sharp and devoid of warmth. "It's a simple job. Watch the premises and ensure nothing goes wrong. If you adhere to the rules, everything will be fine." Scott hesitated but forced himself to nod. He was too eager to take the money and too unsure about letting fear hold him back. His fingers fumbled at the keys to his equipment as Mr. Gray disappeared into the shadows. The office he was assigned to was a small, dimly lit room with a single desk and a wooden chair. A few papers were scattered on the table, but Scott ignored them. His stomach was gnawing at him again, nerves eating away at his confidence. This was supposed to be simple, but as the minutes ticked by, something began to feel very wrong. It started faintly, a sound, just beyond his awareness, a faint tapping that seemed to come from the direction of the locked door. At first, Scott thought it was just his imagination, but then it came again, a deliberate rhythmic sound. He tried to ignore it, focusing instead on checking his phone. But his phone had no service, only a faint buzzing in response as he attempted to connect to the network. His stomach twisted, and he tried to calm himself with logic. It was probably the wind or an animal, some rodent scuttling against the walls. But then came a sound louder and sharper, like a voice. Not a complete sentence, just a low, guttural sound, as if someone, or something, was whispering in the darkness. Scott's heart pounded in his chest as his hand crept toward the flashlight. His throat felt dry, his limbs shaky. "Help!" The sound came again, but this time it was clearer, more deliberate, more human. Scott's hand trembled. He thought about turning on the flashlight, about shining it toward the door, but fear rooted him in place. His own body seemed to betray him, unwilling to confront the sound. His breath came in short, shallow bursts. It was then that he saw movement. The shadows near the locked door were shifting, moving in ways that should have been impossible. Figures, just forms at first, like wisps of smoke, began to coalesce. They weren't people. They weren't shadows. They had shape, but they were wrong, unfamiliar, unrecognizable. Scott's hand clenched tighter around his phone. Panic overtook him as the sound of feet scraping metal joined the whispering, loud now, coming from just beyond the walls. His vision blurred, his breath came harder. His body felt paralyzed. He glanced at the clipboard again. The rules. Do not open the locked door. But his hand was already moving toward it, trembling, his mind unable to resist. He took a step toward the sounds, his heart pounding so hard it threatened to break. He had to know what was in there. Had to. And then the door rattled violently. The sound was like bones against metal, scraping, shaking. His legs gave out and he collapsed to the floor, gasping. He could feel his mind unraveling. "Don't!" came a voice behind him. Mr. Gray's voice, but it sounded colder now, sharper and full of malice. Scott turned his head, and Mr. Gray was there, stepping out of the shadows. His smile was no longer friendly. His eyes, cold and unyielding, met Scott's gaze. "You were warned," Mr. Gray said. Scott would never forget the way his body seemed to give itself over. As the sound of the door grew louder, the shadows began to spill into the room, and he realized the rules didn't matter anymore. The whispers followed him as they drew closer. There was no escape, only the darkness. A couple was on the hunt for a family car. After weeks of searching, they finally found the perfect deal on Craigslist. A reliable SUV, affordable and spacious. The listing came from a seemingly normal seller named Daniel Carter. He had excellent reviews, answered their inquiries promptly, and appeared friendly and trustworthy over messages. With every check performed, they could see no red flags. The perfect car seemed to await them. Excited at their discovery, they met the man in person on a quiet suburban street. The vehicle was parked in the driveway, clean, shiny, and waiting. Daniel greeted them with a friendly smile, shaking their hands, handing them the keys, and signing the paperwork without hesitation. The whole transaction was smooth, simple, and felt oddly too easy. With no second thoughts, the couple loaded up their bags into the trunk and drove off into the cool dusk with their new family car. The first few weeks with their new purchase were nothing short of a blessing. Comfortable, spacious, and perfect for their family of four, it seemed like the car was everything they had hoped for. It drove great, the kids loved it, and the parents were content. But one evening, just as they were returning from a trip, something compelled the wife to clean out the car. She had promised her sister they'd visit them over the weekend, and she wanted to make sure everything was ready. When she opened the trunk, a foul, metallic smell hit her, a mixture of rust and something far worse. Her hands trembled as she searched for the source. Nestled under a blanket was a small, blood-soaked item wrapped tightly in plastic. Panic gripped her as she pulled it free from the cold embrace of the blanket. It was a piece of clothing, old, torn, and covered in fresh blood. She gasped and dropped it, her face paling, the air knocked out of her lungs. Her husband came running, his voice sharp and demanding as he stared at the object. But she couldn't speak. Words wouldn't come. The sight of it felt like poison crawling into her veins. The fabric was unmistakable. A torn, red-stained shirt that reeked of death. Her husband, trying to calm her, suggested they contact the seller. But when they tried to find the contact information, a wave of unease hit them. All of Daniel Carter's online accounts had vanished. His name appeared no longer tied to the car ad, to the sale, or to any of the online platforms he'd used to contact them. Panic overtook logic as they dialed his number, but it went straight to voicemail. At first, they told themselves it must have been a mistake. Maybe it was an accident. Maybe they could resolve it with a simple call. But something gnawed at their instincts. Following the smell, they began tearing through the trunk and searching the vehicle. It was as if the car itself held secrets, as if it breathed a sinister life of its own. They found more items: a glove soaked in blood, a pair of shoes smeared with dirt, and an old wallet. The wallet belonged to someone who looked familiar. Their breaths came in quick, shallow bursts as the realization took hold. They had unknowingly brought something dark into their lives, something unspeakable. That night, unable to ignore the growing paranoia, they decided to confront the man. They scoured Daniel Carter's last known address, a lonely house in a quiet neighborhood, and drove there in haste. It felt like they were running from death itself. When they knocked on the door, they were met with silence. Their unease grew as they noticed how pristine and still the house looked, as though the world itself had stopped breathing behind its walls. No lights flickered, no movement. Finally, a figure appeared in the window, a tall, gaunt figure with piercing dark eyes. Daniel Carter wasn't just the average man they had met. His smile in person, now reflected back in their memory, had been cold and calculated. They knocked harder this time. Their voice shook as they demanded answers, but before they could make sense of their emotions, Daniel opened the door. His smile was thin and cold as he invited them in. There was something wrong with his expression, too rehearsed, too false. His voice was calm, confident, as he explained that accidents could happen. But there was a sinister undertone to every word, as though he already knew what they had found. It wasn't an accident. It never was. They tried to leave, but the moment they stepped onto his porch, they felt the air change. The smell of metal and blood lingered, and Daniel's smile widened. He stepped into their path, blocking them. His voice became sharp, his tone dropping into something far darker. "You shouldn't have come here," he whispered. They froze as his words sank in. A cold fear overtook them, and their muscles locked. Their fight-or-flight instinct screamed to run, but something rooted them to the spot. Their breaths came in shorter bursts as they realized Daniel Carter wasn't just a seller. He wasn't just an average Craigslist user with bad luck and terrible circumstances. He was something else. He had orchestrated this whole thing. Before they could respond, they felt themselves being pulled into his power, as though invisible hands gripped their throats. Panic overtook reason as they stumbled backward, but the figure wouldn't let them go. His voice became sharper, more violent. "If you tell anyone, you'll regret it." They didn't want to believe it, but his words carried a weight that seemed absolute. Their vision blurred as their fears took over. The drive home felt surreal, and in the days following they couldn't shake his presence. His threats lingered. The couple now knew far more than they ever wanted to about the true nature of the man they had invited into their lives, and they also knew the cost of curiosity. It wouldn't stop here. When they tried to piece together what Daniel Carter was, or what he had been, nothing fit. But the sensation of his grip lingered in their bones. It was as if the car, the cellar, the transaction, and the blood were only pieces of a much larger puzzle. A puzzle they would never solve. But the lesson was clear. Some secrets should stay buried, and some ads on Craigslist should always remain unanswered. Now they knew better. And yet, in their dreams, they could still hear the sound of his voice, whispering, waiting, always watching.